Hello everyone and welcome to Tropical Bonsai. Today marks episode 4 of my series, and on this one I'll be showing you how to create bonsai out of many different South Florida native species. To start us off, I have this red stopper that I purchased from the Key West Botanical Gardens. They have a monthly members-only native plant sale, and it's ended up being a great place to buy pre-bonsai material. This tree must have just been repotted before I purchased it, because when I pulled it out of its fairly large planter pot, the root ball was a lot smaller than I had expected it to be. Regardless, I put it in this 2-foot by 2-foot wooden box that I built, which will give it a lot of room to grow and mature in the future. Here I am sprinkling some mycorrhizal fungus into the root base. It will help the roots uptake water and nutrients, so it's the perfect thing to supplement a bonsai potting with. After getting the rest of the soil filled in, here's what the tree was looking like. With my first cut, I took a large leader off the front of the tree. I think people mostly use this species as a landscaping hedge down here in the Florida Keys where I live, and this one was certainly grown seemingly with that in mind. The decisions I'll make for this initial pruning session will focus mostly around eliminating any branches that are crossing and cleaning up a pretty complex canopy as it stands right now. What I like about overgrown pre-bonsai like this is that you pretty much can take the tree in any direction that you want. There's enough branches, enough leaders in every direction that you can pick and choose pretty freely how to style the tree. It also puts us in a position to have a more mature looking tree after just one styling. While the tree was sitting in the pot growing, it was able to start the ramification process on its own. This red stopper's leaves have also stayed pretty small as it's grown, which is a good sign for its viability as a bonsai species. It apparently looks nice when it flowers too, so that'll be another thing to look forwards to. You see me tugging at some of the smaller branches, just trying to make decisions on which ones I want to keep and which ones I'll remove from the tree. Because it's from the Key West Botanical Gardens, and they get their native plant material by going out and digging them up, from the state forests and the public lands in the Keys, it's entirely possible that this red stopper actually originated on my specific island, and if not, it at least came from very close by. While probably not a huge deal for most tropical species, it's nice to know at least that these plants have already adapted to the specific microclimate that they're going to be living in my yard, and it means that I can pretty much repot them into shallow bonsai pots immediately upon taking them home. Versus if I had ordered something online, I would probably put it in a semi-full sun spot in my yard, in the pot that it arrived in, and leave it there for a while, just to make sure that it's had a chance to acclimate. After cleaning up the little bottom part of the canopy, I started to apply my first piece of wire. I find that it's usually easier for me to work from the bottom to the top of a bonsai tree, and so that will entail me doing some initial pruning on the bottom portion, switching gears, doing a little bit of wiring, and working back and forth until I've ultimately done the whole tree. And there goes another fairly large leader off the tree. I'm going to be collecting all of these larger cuttings that I take, and try to get them to root. That way I'd have some more material to either turn this planting into a forest penjing in the future, or keep the smaller cuttings and use them for something else. I've talked in previous episodes about how the wooden boxes are great for training bonsai trees, because you can put additional anchors wherever you want and pull branches at a very specific angle. I left it for a little while I worked on the right side of the tree, but eventually decided that this middle branch that I had shortened earlier was probably better off coming off entirely. There's a skinnier leader behind it that will be a lot easier to manipulate, and just by the nature of where it's growing out of will give the tree some more depth, as opposed to the thicker branch I just cut off. I added another screw to my wooden box, this time in the front, and used it in a somewhat unconventional way to pull that smaller branch I was talking about upwards and give the tree a better silhouette from the front. At this point I was pretty happy with how I had compacted and shaped the right side of the tree, so I moved over to the left side. Even the larger branches on this red stopper are pretty malleable and pretty easy to wire up, so overall this was a really fun tree to work on. The last order of business was sort of thinning out the foliage towards the top of the tree, and I just used the same logic that I did for the bottom portion of the tree, focusing on making sure we eliminate crossing branches and sort of emphasizing simplicity in the structure of the tree. Not so much the foliage, but the trunk and the branches sort of remind me of the Royal Poinciana trees that I see pretty much growing everywhere in my area. Coincidentally, another good bonsai species, and I have a full-sized one growing in my backyard that I've set up a couple air layers on, so with any luck I'll have a couple of those to show you guys as well. As we approach the end of this pruning session, we can really start to appreciate the structure of the tree. I really like the imbalance between the shorter right side of the tree and the taller left side of the tree, so I decided to go with that and leave a lot of the remaining height. I played with these couple of branches that I wired for a little while before I finally decided on a position that I really liked. It can also be helpful when making pruning decisions to be able to rotate the tree, especially early in the bonsai process when you're more likely to potentially change what the front of the tree is down the line. Here's the red stopper all finished up. It's kind of swimming in its 2-foot by 2-foot pot that I made for it, but I'm sure over time it'll grow to fill out the pot. And if anything, it'll give me a while before I have to worry about it becoming root bound. The tree's got a lot of cuts to heal over now, but luckily I was able to get most of them pretty flush with the rest of the branches, so hopefully it won't take more than a year for those to fully heal over. And here's one last look after I carried it over to its spot on the bench and gave it an initial watering. Hopefully it'll do well in the full sun and start growing for us. The next species I want to showcase is called the paradise tree, and it's one of the more unique looking native trees to South Florida. They grow like weeds around my yard, so I was able to dig up all of these, and I figured with such an abundance I should make something like a forest penjing out of them. I started the wooden box with a thin layer of soil and then got to planting. I used wire to hold the trees in place and added some limestone rocks to add texture to the planting. These rocks are also just from around my yard, so they go well with the native South Florida theme. Eventually I got all 10 paradise trees planted into the pot and watered. I was able to get a nice assortment of saplings, which creates a juxtaposition between the really tiny saplings at the front right of the pot and the towering, much taller trees that are towards the back left. Here's a look at the same forest planting just a few months later. I'm pretty sure we've had all but one of the trees survive the repotting, so I'll keep a close eye on the one that I think is dead and ultimately replace it with another paradise tree sapling, if it ever ends up coming to that. I'll also be interested to see how these trees mature. In nature, they don't really ramify that much, even when they grow to pretty tall heights. So I'm not too sure about how much work I'm actually going to need to put into developing a branch structure on these trees. This is also a planting that I think could benefit from a little figurine of maybe somebody sitting on the rock or laying down on the forest floor looking upwards. The scale is already pretty good between the big boulder and the smaller saplings and the big trees, so I think that just something little like that would really set it off. Next, I have something that's not a native to South Florida, but is actually a pretty common landscaping choice, which is actually kind of weird considering where it does originate from, this being a Norfolk Pine coming from an island in Australia. But I guess I shouldn't be too surprised because we also have an abundance of Australian pines, otherwise known as beach she oaks, that grow around here in the Florida Keys. So it's clear that these Pacific species don't really have any aversion to growing on the Atlantic Ocean as well. But anyways, my inspiration for this planting are the two giant Norfolk pines that my neighbor across the street has had growing in their yard for God knows how long. And when I look up at those, it's pretty obvious that these Norfolk pines like to grow in basically an evergreen conical shape, and they don't ever really develop that much ramification. So my pruning decisions for these in the future will probably be pretty different from something like a flat-leafed deciduous tree. As spring continues to pass and summer approaches, everything is growing in the garden, plants and animals. So here's a baby corn snake that my girlfriend found, rattling his tail like he's a big scary rattlesnake or something. And this video doesn't quite do it justice just how small the snake was, but I think it had not even had a meal yet. It was just out of the egg. My next species to showcase is another Florida native. This is a black ironwood tree. This is another plant that I bought from the Key West Botanical Gardens native plant sale. And to be honest, I wasn't really familiar with this species at all until I saw a couple specimens for sale when I went to that plant sale. If you can make out that faded Sharpie, the tag on this plant actually says Ironwood, dated 2014, which would mean that it's been 11, almost 12 years since this tree was actually collected, and who knows how much longer that it had been growing out in nature. That kind of age just sitting at the botanical gardens was pretty crazy to me, but it honestly looks like it could be that old, and especially if it's been sitting in this shallow pot for that long, it would make sense that it's still that small. If we're working on a tree that could be approaching 15 to 20 years old, I'll have to make sure that I do it justice. So, like I highlighted earlier, I'll start towards the bottom of the tree and do some pruning and wiring and eventually work my way up towards the top. And with some initial wiring and pruning done, it was then time to make a very large cut. Over the years, this black ironwood has grown too tall to be in scale with the trunk and to work as a bonsai tree, so I made the decision that I wanted to cut off maybe the top third of this tree. I just ended up using my hacksaw, which honestly was not a very good tool for this job, but it eventually worked. And once I started the cut, there was no going back, so here's how the tree looked once I removed that top portion. You'll notice I cut the trunk down just above a pretty large leader, and my idea for this is that I'm going to let that leader grow for a while and let it thicken up, and eventually, hopefully it will grow large enough that it starts to cover up the scar that I've made on the tree by cutting that top third off. I could see the tree's future going that way, or I could also see a reality in which the leader doesn't grow fast enough and I eventually cut it off and try to employ more of a technique where you just shave down the top of the tree. I've seen people do that on stuff like bald cypresses before. But for now I'm going to let the leader go and see where it is in another year or so. Moving from one Florida native to another, we have not only a species, but a genus, Ficus, with the two species of Ficus that are native to South Florida, as well as another that just grows really well down here. The two that are native to the Florida Keys, the strangler fig and the shortleaf fig, are almost identical when you're just looking at them as a specimen. The two pieces of advice that I've received is that if it has aerial roots and it is growing on a rock or somewhere out of the soil, it's more likely to be a strangler fig. And also that the strangler figs, their little petioles, when they push out new foliage, tend to be green, and the petioles of new foliage on a shortleaf fig tend to be red. So I'm pretty sure all of these wild bonsai trees I spotted growing on the different rocks around my island are the epiphytic strangler fig, but I will use them as inspiration all the same for this shortleaf fig that I also purchased from the Key West Botanical Gardens. I think this is actually two trees that have grown and fused together over time, but you'll notice that there's a complete lack of aerial roots, where if we were dealing with a strangler fig, there would definitely be some aerial roots growing down. I started making some cuts and it became very obvious how sticky the sap was. It apparently can also be a mild irritant, so maybe use some caution when you're working with this species. After just a little bit of pruning and wiring, the shortleaf fig was beginning to take shape. I'm not sure what all those holes eaten into the leaves were, but whatever was eating it at the botanical gardens doesn't seem to have followed it home to me, and you'll see here in a second when I show you the update that it's looking a lot healthier now. This tree has certainly lived up to the ficus's reputation of being very fast growers. And if you'll notice, there's some weird ground cover plant/weed that's popped up in the pot. So that must be from the botanical gardens as well, because I don't usually see foliage like that around my house. I've been really happy with how this tree is growing, and honestly it's growing so fast I'll probably have to take some time to remove the wire here in the next coming months, but luckily that's always a sign that at least something is going right. And as promised, this next ficus is a species that is not native to South Florida, but grows really well and grows in a ton of places around here. This is the Ficus microcarpa, aka the Chinese banyan tree, and this specific variant is actually called the Green Island ficus. There's a ton of different types of Ficus microcarpa that I guess all the leaves slightly differ, and that's why they've given them different names, but Ficus ginseng, Green Island ficus, Chinese banyan, all of these refer to the exact same species, Ficus microcarpa. But before we work this tree, we have to deal with a little bit of a hitchhiker that was in the pot with the ficus. This is a little moringa sapling, otherwise known as the drumstick tree, and I have a full-size version of this tree that was growing in my yard when I bought the house, so we get plenty of saplings anytime that it flowers, gets pollinated, and then ultimately produces seeds. While very different from ficuses, this is also another good tropical bonsai material, and I actually have a larger pre-bonsai that I dug up earlier in 2025. Back to the Green Island ficus, it's now out of its pot, and you can see it's actually two separate trees that have been growing together. And just to make sure it fits nicely, I'm trimming off just a little bit more of the roots. After that, I just tied the tree in place, and it was time for some bonsai soil. I'm using this technique of packing in the soil with the blunt end of a chopstick so that there's no air pockets and that the trees fit snugly in the pot. Here's how the trees looked after I finished up that process, and you can pretty much immediately notice the difference in aerial roots coming off these Chinese banyan trees versus the shortleaf fig that we worked on. I ended up tentatively picking a front for this tree, but I think I really need to let it grow a little bit more before I really lock myself into what I want to be the front. My final decision was to add a limestone rock to the planting. I wanted to do this kind of as an homage to those strangler figs that I showed you in the beginning of this section, growing wild around my island. So we'll see how the aerial roots take to the rock, and ultimately what direction I want to take this tree in the future. Our next tree is the Inkwood, which is another South Florida native, and much like the black ironwood, I didn't even really know that this species existed until I saw that they were selling it at the Key West Botanical Gardens. But as you can see, the tree already looks like it has a little bit of character in the trunk, and it clearly has a lot of weeds growing in the pot. So our first order of business is going to be to get it out of there and put it into a terracotta training pot. I find that I really just prefer to use my hands, or if I need to get the root ball cleaner, I'll use the hose, as opposed to a root rake. With these early in development, pre-bonsai trees that don't have a nicely manicured root base, if you go in with a rake, you'll just do a lot of damage and tear off maybe a lot more than maybe you were expecting to, so I find it easier in this early stage to be more gentle with it and just use my hands. Next, I just use the chopstick technique again in order to make sure that that tree is really firmly planted into the pot. Much like the Green Island Ficus, I'm not really 100% on what I want to be the front of this tree yet, so I'm very open to viewer suggestions in the comments if anybody maybe has any better ideas than I do. I used a couple pieces of bonsai wire for this tree, but I didn't actually wrap any of the branches. I just used it to pull two of the branches a little bit down, closer down towards the ground. The main accomplishment of this Inkwood tree for today is going to be getting it into a more bonsai style pot, and that's already happened, so as long as we maybe encourage a little bit more movement in the tree as it grows, I'm already kind of happy with how it's turned out for today's work. Moving on, we have a non-native pomegranate tree, and this is actually the last tree that I'm going to give a full in-depth breakdown for on this episode. I got this one from Home Depot, and its super gnarled trunk was obviously the main draw for me. Once I got them cleaned off, the existing roots already looked pretty impressive, so I was excited to get to work on the tree. I started by cleaning up the bottom of the tree and then made a haphazard attempt to wire some of the larger branches that I had left. Fast forward a couple months and you can see that the tree has grown a lot and that there's also no bonsai wire on the tree. The new leaders on this pomegranate grew so fast that in under a week's time I ended up having to take that initial bonsai wire off because it was just really starting to bite into the branch. So I gained a lesson learned there, and at least for the time being I'm just going to go forwards with the clip and grow method for this tree, and forgo any bonsai wire entirely. So here I go, getting rid of some of the leaders, starting with the ones growing out of the base of the tree. If you're in a situation where the tree has some reverse taper to it and it sort of gets wider as you go up towards the top of the tree, it can actually be beneficial to leave some of those leaders on the bottom and let them grow for a few seasons, thicken up the bottom of the trunk, and then trim them off. But the bottom of the trunk is already pretty nicely tapered on this pomegranate, so I'm going to go ahead and take them off now. I cut the main leader just about in half, and this does a lot to put the tree back in a bonsai scale. And then finally, with the last couple of decisions made, this tree is all done for the day. This is one of the first fruit trees that I've had, bonsai or otherwise, so I'll be excited to see how it goes in the future. I really want to thank whoever's made it this far into the video. Over 30 minutes is pretty crazy. I'll leave you with this quick clip of another bougainvillea bonsai that I've created, and I hope that you got something out of this video, whether that be some knowledge for your own bonsai collection or just some entertainment. This has been Tropical Bonsai, Episode 4. Thank you so much for watching.